Hello crafty friends, it's Alicia here with a project for Tailored Expressions. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to create a cute, quick, and colorful birthday card, and we're going to be stretching some of our supplies in the process. The main stars of today's card will be the 16 candles die set, the piece of cake layering stencil, and the piece of cake dies. Supporting products include stitched rectangle stacklets, arch stacklets, mini strips birthday stamp, and the coordinating mini strips die. Colors featured on today's card are candy corn, cherry pop, Concord grape, tropical punch, and pea pod, as well as the brand new hot fudge and sweet corn. I also got out the ink shown on screen and the coordinating blending brushes. To help with embellishing, I got out Glossy Accents, purple glitter drops, TE vellum, and 3 Olo markers. For the sentiment stamping, I got out VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, the Just Press tool, and TE exclusive Teal Misty. And I'll be using a variety of adhesives to hold everything together. Let's get crafty! I'm going to get started by stenciling the piece of cake layering stencil set, and I'll be stenciling onto a piece of sugar cube that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I did tack that down temporarily to my grid paper placemat just so it stays in place while I'm doing the blending. The first stencil I'll be using is the one with the 3 cake layers, and I'll be using candy corn, Concord grape, and pea pod for this. Like I mentioned in the intro, we're going to be stretching our supplies today. Instead of using this stencil set to create a layered cake, I'm actually going to use it to create a pattern border on the left of my piece of sugar cube. This is a great way to add color and again stretch those supplies. I'm going to start by having that first layer at the top of the cardstock, and I'm going to mark where the corners of the stencil are, just so later when I go to place the second stencil, I know kind of where to get started. I'm going to be using removable labeling tape to cover up areas of the stencil that I don't want to be inked up quite yet, and I got started with the candy corn ink. I got my brush all loaded up and then used clockwise and counterclockwise motions to fill in that first layer. I just keep blending until I like the saturation, and then I'm going to move on to Concord grape. I did go ahead and tear that piece of labeling tape in half so I could cover up the area above and below the layer that I want purple. Then this is pretty much the same as the orange. I just keep ink blending until I like the color. I moved the labeling tape again and finished off the bottom layer with pea pod, and now before I move on, I am going to go clean this stencil very well. I'm going to use it again with the same colors, but I want to make sure that the ink that is sitting on the stencil doesn't get moved in or blended in to the next color I use. To set up the second round of this stencil, I'm going to use that same line on the grid to left align my stencil, but I move it down so there's about the same amount of room between the pea pod layer and the next layer, which will once again be candy corn. When that is in place, once again, I mark those corners, so when I do the second stencil, it's going to be easy to get it set up. Then, using all of the same processes as the first round, I ink blend those next 3 layers. For the second layer, I'm going to be using Cherry Pop and Tropical Punch ink, and I'm going to get it in place using that first set of marks I created. Once that's taped down, I'm going to blend with the Cherry Pop and the Tropical Punch, and again, I clean the stencil before I go and move it down for the second round, and here is a look at the stencil all finished. I always love the big reveal. To cut this down for the card front, I will be using the largest stitched rectangle stacklet, and I tried to preserve as much of the white space over on the right, and later you'll see how I used the scrap that was left over. Some other die cutting I did while I was off camera was I used a 1/3 from largest arch stacklet on a piece of vellum. You'll see here that when I place it over our stenciled piece, you can still see those colors, but it's going to help the cake stand out, which is something else I cut while I was off camera. I used the layer part and some scraps to cut the same colors as I stenciled, and for the cake base, I used the new sweet corn. And speaking of that color, I will be cutting the 1 and 0 as well as the flame from the 16 candles die set. And to make my frosting look extra delicious and chocolatey, I'll be using the new Hot Fudge for the frosting toppers. Once all of those pieces were cut, I used Barely Art liquid glue to adhere everything together. This is going to give me a little bit of wiggle time to adjust my frosting just right, and I added dab on top of each of the wicks so I can add my flame. To add a little bit more realism to the fire, I brought in Olo marker OR 1.3 and colored in the little center area. Now later I do switch that up just a bit. All of the pieces for my focal point were cut, so I started to assemble the cake. To hold the vellum in place while I added each of the pieces, I did temporarily tack it down, and then starting with the cake stand at the bottom, I worked my way up until I topped it off with my 2 candles. Off camera, I added some foam sticky strips to the back of the vellum piece, and I also made a top folding sweet corn card base. To the inside, I added a piece of sugar cube and decorated the left with some of the leftover stenciling. I got my stenciled piece added to the front center of the card base. For now, I'm just using tape runner to keep everything nice and flat, and then I tacked that temporarily closed so that I could get my vellum piece put in place. I did add some Barely Art liquid glue to the top of the foam tape, just so when I go to put it on the card front, I have a little bit of wiggle time to adjust it so it's nice and straight across and centered. Now you will notice that my candles stick up off the top of the card, so this might be one that you want to give out by hand. Now at this point I decide, you know what? I don't like the yellow flame on the yellow background. So I made another top fold card base, this time in cherry pop, and because I used tape runner, I can just carefully peel off the elements I already put in place and get it on the new card base. Let me know down in the comment section below if you prefer the sweet corn or the cherry pop base. To make that chocolate frosting look extra ooey and gooey, I brought in some Glossy Accents and added it to the Hot Fudge frosting. What I like to do when I do Glossy Accents is kind of draw an outline with the liquid and then use the nozzle to just fill it in. If there are any open spaces, then I just add a little bit more of the Glossy Accents until everything is nice and full. I set that to the side for probably about an hour to dry completely. While that was drying, I went ahead and worked on the sentiment. For this, I'll be using Mini Strips Birthday with the VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. I got a scrap of sugar cube put into the MISTI and then set up the stamp on it. The cool thing about this is I just have to ink up and stamp one image, but then I have tons of sentiments, not only for this card if I want to use multiple, but for later projects. Now make sure when you ink these types of stamps up, you do ink up the squares because those are going to help you align the coordinating die to get it all cut out. Look at how fun that glossy frosting is. For the sentiment, I knew I wanted one that was just a little bit wider than the cake layers. So I chose Happy Happy Birthday and I added that with some liquid glue across the center of the red layer. I decided that I wanted to add a little bit more color to the candle flames, so while the sentiment was drying, I brought in that original OR 1.3 and then I also pulled in OR 1.6 and YO 2.3. I ended up going in the bottom of the flame with a little bit of the OR 1.6. I blended that out just a little bit with that original marker, OR 1.3, and then finished blending it all the way to the tip of the flame with the YO 2.3. I thought this made it stand out a little bit more and gave some more depth to the flame. To finish the card off, I added a trio of purple glitter drops to the upper right. And here are some close-up looks at the finished card. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. If you enjoyed the process, a thumbs up is appreciated. And if you're not already a subscriber, We do hope you'll click on the button below so you're the first to know about our latest videos. To find out more about the products I used today, you can check out the links in the description box or visit the Tailored Expressions online store at tailoredexpressions.com.